Sora. Sora, subí.
When Joanna and Hank inherited the old family farm after Joanna's grandmother passed away, they were excited to start a new life in the country. But once they arrived, they realized just how much work the rundown property needed. The barn was in disrepair, the equipment was rusty and broken, and the fields were vastly overgrown. While Hank set to work mending fences and getting the tractor running again, Joanna tackled the enormous task of clearing and tilling the fields. After days of back-breaking labor, she finally had the overgrown tangles cut back enough to start planting. To protect the new garden from hungry deer and birds, Joanna constructed a makeshift scarecrow out of some old work clothes stuffed with straw. She placed the scarecrow in the middle of the fresh rows of veggies and hoped it would do the trick. That first night, Joanna thought she heard odd noises coming from the garden, rustling and something that sounded like footsteps crunching down the rows. Peering out the farmhouse window into the moonlit night, she saw the scarecrow still posted in the midst of the vegetables, its shirt sleeves fluttering lightly in the breeze. Reassured, Joanna went back to bed. But the sounds returned the following night, along with something even more disturbing, a dark, hulking shadow that seemed to move unnaturally through the garden. Joanna peered hard into the darkness, but saw nothing amiss. Then something touched her shoulder from behind, making her scream. It was just Hank. "Come to bed. You're letting this old farm spook you," he said gently. "Nothing out there but the scarecrow." Nevertheless, Joanna insisted they do a full inspection of the farmhouse and outbuildings to be sure. Hank found nothing alarming in his searches, though he did discover the padlock on the old storm cellar around back had been broken. The doors gaped open into inky darkness when he shined his flashlight down. Probably just some critter nesting down there, Hank said, securing the doors with a new lock. Nothing to worry about. But over the following week, the nocturnal disturbances escalated. Joanna would wake to find long furrows torn through the garden, seedlings uprooted and vegetables smashed. Massive footprints marred the rows, and the scarecrow now lurked deeper among the crops, its arms jutting out at unnatural angles. One evening at dusk, Joanna thought she saw two dark, tall shapes slipping into the woods beyond the garden. Gripping Hank's rifle, she circled around behind where the figures had disappeared, but she found nothing besides a strange pile of straw heaped by a tree. Uneasy, Joanna headed back to the house. Later that night, screams jolted Joanna and Hank from sleep. They stumbled from bed and were horrified to see the scarecrow skulking outside their window, ragged mouth gaping in the moonlight as it scraped its wooden hands down the glass. Joanna aimed her rifle through the window and fired, blasting the scarecrow's head to pieces. It collapsed to the ground. Hank cautiously went outside to inspect the scarecrow's body. Joanna waited by the door, reloaded rifle at the ready. But when Hank rolled the figure over, it wasn't the scarecrow at all. It was the bloody, lifeless body of Mr. Jenkins, their elderly neighbor from down the road. Barely stifling a scream, Joanna backed away into the house. Hank followed, ashen-faced. But if that wasn't the scarecrow, where? A creaking floorboard directly overhead cut off his words. They both looked up in dawning horror as heavy, deliberate footsteps crossed the ceiling. The cellar doors suddenly exploded outward as two figures came lurching into view. One was the scarecrow, straw poking out from its tattered clothes. The other was Jenkins' wife, her eyes glowing red and her mouth open impossibly wide to emit an unearthly shriek. Before Joanna or Hank could react, they charged into the house. The fight was brief but savage. The creature showed no pain as Hank and Joanna emptied round after round into them. Even dismembered, the scarecrow continued flailing and clawing, its burlap face leering wildly. Finally, Hank shoved the remains into the fireplace and burned them to ash. As dawn broke, he and Joanna slowly began to accept the truth that Jenkins and his wife must have been practicing some evil magic out here in the country, and had transformed themselves into animated scarecrows after death for revenge. Shaken, Hank and Joanna decided rural life wasn't for them after all. They put the farmhouse on the market the very next day. Only the charred patch in the living room floor hinted at the horrors they had faced there, and by summer's end, a young couple was delighted to buy the property, unintentionally moving their family into a home still haunted by the scarecrow's revenge. When Caleb and his wife Jenna moved to the small rural town of Goshen, they were charmed by the quaint community and friendly residents, and the old farmhouse set on 20 acres of land was the perfect place to start their family. Caleb prepared the back fields for planting corn while Jenna learned tips and tricks from the local farm wives. Soon enough, knee-high green stalks were rippling across the back acreage, and Caleb lovingly tended to the crop. Late one evening, Jenna stepped out onto the creaking porch. Caleb was still out in the west field working despite the fading light. Suddenly, Jenna thought she heard a strange shuffling and snapping sound coming from the cornfield. Squinting into the dusk, she saw the tall stalks swaying and jerking violently as if someone was plowing through them. Jenna called Caleb's name, but there was no answer over the racket of the unseen intruder in the field. She sprinted into the house and grabbed a shotgun from over the mantel. Running back onto the porch, she fired a blast into the air. The sounds from the cornfield abruptly stopped. "Caleb!" Jenna shouted desperately. Her breath caught as her husband finally emerged from between the rows of corn. His face was pale and sweaty when Jenna fell into his arms. "You wouldn't believe it if I told you," Caleb whispered. "I was halfway through weeding the back acre when the corn just exploded around me. Something huge was tearing through it, snapping off stalks left and right. I tripped over a root trying to get away from it. That gunshot was the only thing that made it retreat." Jenna felt cold fear flooding through her. What could possibly have caused that violent rampage through the cornfield? She searched Caleb's shadowed face, but he had no explanation to offer. The next morning, Jenna walked Caleb out to survey the damage. Most of the back acre was trampled flat, broken stalks covering the ground. Caleb slowly fanned out into the edges of the field still untouched, searching for clues. He suddenly shouted for Jenna. She rushed to his side and followed his pointing finger in horror. There, sunk deep in the soft soil, was a massive footprint, far too large to belong to any man or beast either of them could imagine. The depth of the print spoke of incredible weight. Jenna's mind reeled at the size of a creature who could leave such a mark. Caleb and Jenna decided to start doubling up on their own foot patrols, taking shifts walking the perimeter of the farm with their firearms. But each night, more stalks were destroyed as whatever monstrous thing lurked in their cornfield returned to feed. Caleb began fortifying the doors and windows of the old farmhouse too, unsure if the attacks on the field would eventually turn to the home itself. Late one moonless night during Jenna's patrol, an abrupt flurry of crunching corn made her raise her rifle. At the edge of the field, a hulking shape grew out of the darkness. Jenna aimed at its center mass and fired. An unearthly bellow rang out as the creature staggered back, letting the cornstalks close over it once again. Jenna raced back to the house. Together, she and Caleb ventured back out into the night. Flashlights raised cautiously. There was no blood trail to follow, but the corn had been savagely torn up in one area. Exchanging an uneasy glance, they returned to the farmhouse feeling anything but relieved. The attacks stopped for several days. Caleb spent hours reinforcing the barricaded windows while Jenna pored through dusty old books, searching for anything that could explain the freakish happenings. Then Caleb woke before dawn one morning to use the outhouse. Halfway across the yard, he froze at a massive looming shape next to the barn. A pair of glowing red eyes stared out of the darkness at him. The thing let out a gurgling snort and shifted, metallic limbs glinting in the moonlight. Caleb realized he was facing an enormous mechanized monster, like an insectoid harvester. Jagged pincers spread open at its front as it took a lumbering step towards the paralyzed man. Caleb finally found the will to run, dashing back into the farmhouse, but the machine followed, condensation puffing from a grate on its back as it squeezed between buildings with an ear-rending screech. Jenna screamed as Caleb burst into the bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind him. Heavy footsteps shook the floorboards as the clicking, whirring harvester closed in. Caleb and Jenna clutched each other helplessly, crying out as the windows shattered inwards under the machine's pincers. Just before one of the pincers clamped around Caleb's torso, Jenna grabbed the oil lamp from the nightstand and hurled it. The glass shattered on the metal hull of the creature and flames exploded outward. The harvester reared back, letting out an unearthly screeching sound. Jenna and Caleb ducked beneath the windowsill as the machine thrashed wildly, gouts of fire and smoke boiling off it. The ear-splitting commotion finally died away. Cautiously raising their heads, the couple gaped at the charred mechanical corpse sprawled in their yard, smoke still rising from its melted joints. Over the following days, Sheriff McGee pieced together the full bizarre tale after speaking with townsfolk. Old man Ferris up on the ridge had been tinkering with robotics for years. No one had realized he'd succeeded in building a monstrosity and programming it to secretly collect biomatter from Caleb's cornfields to power its steam engine. Jenna had thankfully shot McGee an email about the crop vandal, bringing the mechanical thefts to his attention. When McGee confronted Ferris, the old man reluctantly showed the sheriff his notebook of designs and steam-powered diagrams. Disheartened, Ferris agreed to power down his robots for good. He hadn't foreseen his harvester hurting Caleb or Jenna. He insisted, only collecting resources the cheapest way he knew how. Caleb was less forgiving, but he decided against pressing charges after Ferris agreed to pay damages. In the charred husk of the monstrous machine left in his yard, Caleb finally recognized the end to their farming nightmare. He squeezed Jenna's hand in relief, grateful they'd survived the deadly cornfield creeper. The old McAllister farm had stood empty for over a decade ever since old man McAllister passed away. The land had gone to seed, the fences were sagging and broken, and the shutters hung crookedly from the weathered farmhouse. Only the barn seemed to be holding up all right, despite the peeling red paint and rust spots. When James and his wife Emily bought the property, they thought they had landed a perfect fixer-upper project. The first few weeks were full of hard work, sweat, and more than a few wasp stings. But gradually the overgrown fields were tamed and the farmhouse started shaping up. It was on one hot summer night that the noises started up in the barn. James had just headed off to bed after a long day of tearing up rotted floorboards on the porch. He had just drifted off when a ferocious howling split the silence, jolting him upright. The horrendous baying and snarling seemed to go on and on, accompanied by violent crashes that shook the whole house. Grabbing his shotgun, James rushed out into the moonlit yard, clad only in his boxers. Breathless, he wrenched open the barn door and swept the beam of his flashlight back and forth. Nothing. The decrepit stalls and hayloft were empty, the dust drifting through the shafts of moonlight. The noises had ceased just as abruptly as they'd started. Shaken, James returned to the house. Emily blinked at him sleepily from their bed and mumbled everything okay, reassuring her it was just some stray dogs. James crawled back under the sheets, but the same blood-curdling howls erupted the next night, and the next. By the end of the week, James and Emily were hollow-eyed with exhaustion. On the seventh night, James decided he was going to get to the bottom of this mystery once and for all. He grabbed a coil of rope and a flashlight and headed for the barn just before midnight. The night was clear and quiet, a light breeze stirring the wheat fields that rustled softly in the darkness. As he crossed the yard, James felt the hair on his arms prickling in anticipation. He made his way up the creaking ladder to the hayloft, sweeping his flashlight beam over the debris and abandoned bird nests. He secured one end of the rope around a roof beam and tested it with a hard yank. Then he gathered an armload of loose hay around himself and settled down to wait, flashlight and shotgun by his side. It was approaching 2 a.m. when the first spine-chilling howl split the silence. James jerked awake, his heart rabbiting in his chest. The shrieking and snarling was deafening as it filled the barn below. Gripping his shotgun with slick palms, James clambered over the lip of the hayloft and aimed his flashlight down into the roiling darkness. The sight that met his eyes froze the breath in his lungs. Dozens of pale bodies, but not bodies. Faces seemed to be floating across the barn floor. Their limbs trailed off into ragged mist, yet their mouths gaped open impossibly wide as chilling screams and horrible howls issued forth. Yellow eyes darted wildly as the phantoms swirled around each other, uttering those awful sounds. James swayed, dizzy with shock and terror. His fingers slipped onto the trigger of his shotgun, and he fired reflexively. The shot boomed through the cavernous barn, tearing through one of the ghostly faces. It dissipated instantly with an unearthly shriek. The rest of the haunting faces twisted towards the hayloft, their empty eyes fixing upon James as their baying reached a frenzied pitch. Fumbling in his panic, James barely managed to get the rope secured under his arms before launching himself off the hayloft. He swung out over the barn floor and crashed through one of the boarded-up windows, shattering glass everywhere. He hit the ground hard and limped desperately for the house. James burst through the front door and slammed it shut behind him, his heart pounding as the distant shrieks filtered through the walls. Emily found him collapsed on the kitchen floor, shaking and drenched in sweat and blood from numerous cuts. The next morning, as the sun rose, James walked back out to the barn alone. He slowly opened the door. Shafts of light filtered down through the silent hayloft. Dust motes drifted through the air. The stalls were empty, the dirt floor smooth and undisturbed. James shook his head in dismay. Just what in God's name had he seen? Later that day, James drove into town and stopped at the local bar where he knew some of the old-timers liked to gather and gossip. Nursing a beer, he explained what had been happening at the McAllister farm. The bar went silent, all eyes on James. Finally, one old man named Walter cleared his throat. Those ghostly faces you saw, those were the souls of all the runaway slaves old man McAllister captured with his hounds. He'd keep them chained up in his barn till the bounty hunters arrived. Their cries were pitiful, but McAllister ignored them. One day a fire started in the barn. No one knows how. It spread quick. Those poor souls were burned alive, screaming to the high heavens. Walter shook his gray head. McAllister himself survived, but folks say his face was haunted till the day he died. You stirred up something real evil out there. Son, if I was you, I'd leave that cursed place behind for good. A chilled silence settled over the bar. James sat motionless, staring into his beer. He realized now the farm's dark history had left a stain that could never be erased. That very night, James and Emily packed up their belongings and drove away, the ghastly howls echoing behind them from the old McAllister farm.